They say you never forget your first, and this is certainly true of toy collectors. Over the many years that I've run this channel, I've received countless comments from viewers sharing stories of their first toy. Whether it's their first Star Wars or G.I. Joe figure, or their first Masters of the Universe figure, or their first Transformer. Toy collectors always remember their first toy.
They're not toys, this is Iron Man, okay?
So I thought it would be an interesting exercise today to go through not just my first toy that I remember playing with in childhood, but all of my firsts from childhood, from each different toy line that I collected and played with in the day. So join me for a trip down a vintage toy memory lane. Stay tuned.
Come with me, toy fans.
Hey toy fans, my name is Tony and welcome back to the Analog Toys YouTube channel. And the first real toy that I remember playing with in childhood, beyond, just your basic teddy bear kind of thing, was Fisher-Price Adventure People. And the first toy that I had was the Aero Marine Search Team set. This really cool set that had a helicopter and a submarine, a couple of figures, an octopus that used to scare the crap out of me when I was a kid. And this was an amazing bath time toy. The helicopter had this really cool hook assembly that you could hang from underneath the aircraft and use it to take the submarine out to whatever location it needed to be dropped. Or it could pick up this cage, which came with a sunken treasure chest. The two action figures that came with this set, you got the helicopter pilot and then the scuba diver, who also came with like a scuba tank accessory. And this complete set just gave me hours and hours of enjoyment in childhood. The submarine, it had these really cool gripping claws on the front, spring-loaded, that you could use to capture the octopus or pick up that sunken treasure chest. And I'm super grateful to my parents for kicking off my toy journey in childhood with such an amazing set from the Fisher-Price Adventure People line.
I am Aquaman.
Now the next first for me was kind of a first and only, and it was my first and only Evel Knievel toy. And that was the gyro-powered Evel Knievel stunt cycle, which came with this really cool Evel Knievel figure. He was a Bendham, which kind of made sense because he was going to get bashed around, being thrown around by the stunt cycle and that kind of thing. But he came dressed in this classic Evel Knievel outfit, which included a belt, a cane, and of course Evel Knievel's helmet. And when most people think of Evel Knievel toys, you think of them as 1970s toys, but I would have received this, I want to say around 1981, because I recently came across some old family videotape that actually shows me and my father playing with the Evel Knievel stunt cycle on Christmas morning. And over here in the corner, you can actually see the original box. Man, I would just love to have that box again. The Evel Knievel stunt cycle is just a super fun toy. And if you haven't seen it before, I highly recommend going back and watching one of our older videos where we got Evel Knievel to jump Snake Mountain. Now, I'm not sure if it was the same Christmas that I received the Evel Knievel toy, but in childhood I also had this really awesome blow-molded Batman tricycle. And that's not me in the image, that's actually my younger sister. But at some time in my early childhood, my parents also gifted me a CHiPs, the California Highway Patrol, a dress-up uniform. And again, when I came across this old family video, there's footage of me playing around in the garden using the Batman tricycle as my California Highway Patrol motorcycle, dressed up in my CHiPs outfit. I was also a huge fan of the Incredible Hulk in childhood, and while I had a lot of Incredible Hulk toys, the first one I ever received was not an action figure. It was actually this amazing Corgi die-cast Mazda pickup truck that had a small Incredible Hulk figurine in the back with him bursting out of a cage. And this really, really nice example was gifted to the channel by my good mucker, Keith Knight. And when Keith sent this to me, I had no idea that there's actually a variation of this particular Mazda pickup truck. The one I had in childhood had the grey cage, as you can see on the back here. But Keith also sent me this absolutely amazing boxed version that has the variant where the cage is made of red plastic.
Don't take it out!
It loses its value if you take it out of its packaging.
I had no idea, and it's amazing that this community is always educating me on some of these vintage toys that I really enjoy. Corgi Toys in the UK made a lot of different licensed superhero stuff. Of course, their Batman stuff was very, very popular. I did have a Batmobile and a Batboat in childhood. But there's no die-cast toy from my childhood that I'm more fond of than the Corgi Incredible Hulk Mazda pickup truck. Now we get to a toy line that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is Palitoy's Action Man. And I was playing with Action Man from a very early age because I had toys handed down to me from my older brother. but I still remember the first one that was actually bought for me as a new toy. And I want to say this was around 1981 or 1982, and I received the Action Man Space Ranger Captain. And this isn't the original box. As you can see, this is a Toll Toys box. The one that I would have received in childhood would have been a Palitoy box, so I do need to kind of go out and acquire one of those Palitoy boxes one day. One of the issues with the Action Man Space Ranger Captain is that he came with this full body rubber spacesuit, which deteriorates over time like the Frogman suits do. I used to own one, it crumbled and turned to dust, and I'm now at the point where I'm just not interested in acquiring another one or a Frogman outfit, because you pay really a lot of money for these kind of items and they just fall to pieces inside your display cases. But this toy that was gifted to me on maybe a birthday or a Christmas in the early 80s is one of the most prized possessions in my collection, because this is actually one of my surviving childhood Action Men figures. And not just one of the surviving figures, but this was always my favorite Action Man. I'm showing him to you here sitting down because he was so well played with in childhood that all of his joints have become so loose that he just physically cannot stand anymore. And for a long time I actually thought that I had lost my original childhood Action Man. But it turned out that I had dressed him in a uniform and put him into an Action Man Jeep, and it was only when I pulled him out one day for a video that I was making and I wanted to change the uniform, and as soon as I took the shirt off the figure I went, that's my original Action Man figure from childhood, my favourite Action Man. And the reason I know this is because this guy has some scars. You can see some kind of melted plastic on the chest there that I burnt into him in childhood with a hot match head, and then another scar on his arm. And I'm sure this was inspired by the scene in First Blood after Rambo jumps off the cliff and falls through the tree and then stitches up his own arm. And I was obsessed with that film in childhood, and my Action Man often played the role of John J. Rambo. That's why he's got so many scars. And if there was one item that I could grab from my collection, you know, if the house was burning down and I could only grab one thing on the way out of the door, it would be my original childhood Action Man. Now, I really wish that my first Mego superhero in childhood was the Incredible Hulk, and I did eventually receive one. I got the large 12-inch Incredible Hulk, but the first Mego that I actually owned was the Mego 8-inch Spider-Man. And at that time I used to watch Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, the cartoon, and used to try and recreate some of those adventures with this particular action figure, but at that time I had nothing else that scaled with him. And I always found this toy frustrating, that he had this removable costume, but you couldn't turn him into Peter Parker because once the costume came off, he just had a red head and red hands.
Oh, come on.
A very weird toy, and I've got some nostalgic memories of this, but it certainly wasn't something that I played with extensively. My childhood memories of this figure is something that I, probably played with for a week or two and then threw him in the toy bin and moved on to something else. Now, sometime in 1982, I was obviously still very much into Action Man, but I remember my mum taking me into a newsagent's and seeing one of those rotating peg racks full of action figures, and it was the first time that I ever saw Palitoy Action Force. And during a recent trip where my mum came to visit me and she was looking around the collection room, she spotted the Orange Frogman, and she could actually remember the day that she purchased this for me. It was the first ever Action Force figure that I owned. We saw it in this newsagent's one day, and it just so happened that my mum had been paid that day. She had her pay packet on her, and she took out, a £1 coin or £2 coins, whatever it was, to pick up this action figure. And the Orange Frogman is such a classic, iconic item from that first wave of Palitoy Action Force. It's a favourite for many people. Certainly seems to be a favourite for my mum, because she had a huge smile on her face when she was telling me this story of when she first picked this up for me. So of course I acquired this action figure a number of years ago when I was making my video series on Palitoy Action Force. And then at Joe Fest 2023, just 6-7 months ago, I came across a carded example of this. And I'm so happy to finally have not just a mint complete loose example of this figure, but to be able to proudly display a carded version of the Series 1 Orange Frogman in my collection. Now, the next couple of years of my childhood were completely overtaken by He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And the first figures I received for that line, I remember getting them, and this was a 2-for-1 as I was gifted 2 action figures on the same day. And that was He-Man and Beastman. Now, you'd think most kids would want He-Man and Skeletor, but at that time, the cartoon had not yet reached British television, so I didn't know the storyline behind these action figures. I was learning all about it in the mini comics that came with them. And of course I was very happy to get He-Man, he's the hero of the story, but Beastman was also super cool. He's an absolute classic of that first wave, comes with his whip accessory and all that stuff. But I do remember that once I finally saw the cartoon on TV, all of a sudden, Stratos became my obsession. Probably because I was obsessed with those Hawkmen from the 1980 Flash Gordon movie. Now sometimes trying to remember all this stuff from your childhood, like you have these memories, but trying to get them into the correct sequence doesn't always work, and especially if you're like me and you're from the UK, you can look at toy lines and look up on the internet, you know, what year they were released, but if something was released in 1982 in the US, it probably didn't reach the UK until 83 or 84. But I think the next toy line that I moved on to after Masters of the Universe was Galoob's A-Team. And I definitely remember the first figure I got from that line. I got the 6-inch Hannibal, and the reason I remember it so much is because all of us kids wanted Mr. T, but I was still pretty happy with Hannibal. Galoob's A-Team figures, whether they're the 6-inch versions or the 3 3/4-inch versions, they were like some of the cheapest toys on the market in the mid-80s. They had some goofy face sculpts, bad articulation, but of course the coolest thing about getting Hannibal is he was the only one of the 4 main A-Team characters that came with the M60, that classic 80s weapon that I loved from all the Rambo and Schwarzenegger films. For anyone who's watched this channel for a period of time, you'll know that I'm not a massive fan of Transformers, but I did own a couple in childhood. And I'm not 100% certain if I owned 2 or 3. I definitely had Megatron, and I definitely had the Dinobot Triceratops Slag. And I think I had Optimus Prime. If I didn't actually own him, I certainly must have borrowed one from a friend from an extended period of time, because I've got a lot of memories of playing with this toy. I just don't have any memories of actually being gifted one and actually owning one. But my first Transformer was Megatron. And for a kid who wasn't super into Transformers, my parents made a really good choice by gifting me Megatron, because I was always, you know, a military mad kid. I liked all the military toy lines, Rambo, A-Team, Action Force, all of that stuff. So giving me a Transformer that I could actually use as a toy gun, that was a good choice. And after I'd transformed Megatron from the Walther P38 pistol into robot mode, once I'd done that 2 or 3 times, I got pretty bored of it, because the robot version of Megatron really doesn't look that cool. But the pistol version does, especially with all of those add-on accessories. And I used to use this a bit like a James Bond gun, where you could put on an extended barrel, a buttstock, a silencer. That was just super cool to me in childhood. And that's the reason why I've gone out and I've reacquired Megatron today, and I proudly display him in my collection. This box isn't perfect, but it's good enough for my collection. And again, I prefer to display this toy in my collection in the box, because that robot mode just didn't look cool.
It's not a hobby of mine.
Well, then that's the only hobby you don't have.
I've told the story many times that when Action Force International Heroes, which was the British rebranding of G.I. Joe, when that burst onto the scene in 1987, the packaging had changed so much from the original Palitoy style packaging that I thought I was looking at a completely new toy line. And I don't feel as though I need to retell the story again that Barbecue was the first action figure I picked up, because I've done like entire videos about it. So I thought a cool way to end this video would be to talk about the last toy that I ever owned and played with in childhood, because I recently acquired it from my buddy Matt at Reclaimers Vintage Toys. And that is the Cobra Mamba. Now, I moved to Australia in 1988, and I got this either for my birthday or Christmas in 1989. I was 12 years old. The following year I went to high school, and I stopped asking for any kinds of toys. I was asking for surfboards, and I was starting to chase girls and that kind of thing. But the Cobra Mamba will always hold a very, very special place in my heart, because as much as our first toys are important to us, so are our last. It was that last experience I had of childhood imagination, going on adventures with my Action Force and G.I. Joe figures, before moving into the trials and tribulations of puberty and growing hairs and all that crap stuff. The Cobra Mamba is also a really, really cool toy. Much like the G.I. Joe Havoc, where you could open up the back and the recon sled would come out, I always loved it when you got like 2 vehicles for the price of 1. And with the Mamba, you actually got 3 vehicles for the price of 1, because you had these pods on either side that could unclip and shoot off and kind of flank the Joes with some nifty aerial maneuvers. This was also pitched to us in childhood as a supersonic helicopter, and even at the age of 12 I kind of knew it was not really possible for a helicopter to go supersonic. The Cobra Mamba is piloted by the Gyro Viper, and one of the really cool things that I loved about this figure in childhood is his removable helmet that came with this frosted face shield. And even though when I received the Mamba in 1989, it had been several years since I'd ever played with my Star Wars figures, I did pull out my old Luke Skywalker, put this helmet on him, so I could recreate that classic scene where Luke and Ben are aboard the Millennium Falcon and Ben Kenobi is teaching Luke his first lessons about using the Force. So there you have it. There's a bunch of my first toys, first action figures, and the last toy that I ever played with in childhood. But I want to hear from you guys.
So many stories are running through my head right now.
What was some of your first? Did you collect A-Team? What was your first A-Team action figure? What was your first Transformer? What other toys really represent some kind of a milestone in your childhood? Those toys that are special to you because they were gifted to you by a special person, or you got them when you went on a holiday overseas somewhere. We all have these incredible stories to tell, and I love reading about them in the comments on these videos. So please jump into the comments, tell me a number of your firsts, lasts, whatever they were, and I'll see you in the next video.